LGBT representation in South Korean film and television. History of LGBT media in South Korea. The LGBT representation in South Korean media has evolved and changed throughout time. Efforts from groups such as the Rainbow Foundation or Chinkyusai not only changed the atmosphere and attitudes from the public, but also changed the media industry in South Korea. According to Pil Ho Kim and C. Colin Singer, the history and progression of the LGBT representation in South Korean films and dramas can be divided into three separate waves. The first period is the Invisible Age 1945 to 1997, that is followed by the Camouflage Age 1998 to 2004, and the last period is known as the Blockbuster Age 2005 to 12. Pil Ho Kim is currently an assistant professor at Ohio State University who specializes in Korean society and culture. C. Colin Singer was an academic at Yuhu Women's University during the process of this literature. Invisible Age 1945–1997. Kim and Singer describe the period between 1945 and 1997 as the Invisible Age. The word invisible does not necessarily translate to the lack of queer films. There were a few films that incorporated LGBT themes to varying levels. The films that were released during this time period are The Pollen of Flowers 1972, Ascetic Women and Women 1976, Sabangi 1988, and Broken Branches 1995. These films used different approaches and displayed various levels of LGBT representation, but they all fall under the Invisible Age because of their lack of publicity and fame. For example, The Pollen of Flowers is composed of many unprecedented elements such as violence, which steered the conversation away from homosexuality themes in the films. In a different light, Ascetic Women and Women showcased erotic and sexual elements that featured lesbian storyline under a more simplistic or basic narratives. A Korean LGBT magazine named Buddy later categorized Ascetic Women and Women as the first lesbian film, but this effort was still invisible to the larger public sphere due to the fact that Ascetic was seen as an erotic film. Around this time, Ero has evolved to a prominent genre where films that embraced sexuality and intimacy fell under this genre that was associated with words like underground or unofficial. Sabangi is another example of the genre of Ero powerfully overshadowing or masking the LGBT themes in films. Lastly, Broken Branches was the first out of these films to gather some fame out of the invisibility. However, this film was denied from the main activists of the LGBT movement due to its overarching narrative of portraying queerness, a consequential result of patriarchy and Confucianism. For all these reasons above, these films were invisibilized by South Korean society as a whole and therefore symbolized the invisible age of LGBT representation in South Korean media. Camouflage Age 1998–2004. Continuing with Kim and Singer's categorizing, the time period between 1998 and 2004 is referred to as the Camouflage Age. During this time period, the cinematic representation of LGBT communities increased in general. The films of this era mostly portrayed queerness in the background while main themes overshadowed queerness of the film. This was used as a strategy to strike a balance between making the film enticing while not entirely controversial. Some examples of these successful films include Memento Mori 1999 and Bungee Jumping of Their Own 2001. Memento Mori is a horror movie about a lesbian couple in an all-girl high school. The plot continues with the couple enduring terrible bullying which results in one of the girls committing suicide. After the tragic incident, horror element begins to surface as the ghost appears and haunts the school. Not only does the horror genre along with the revenge trope successfully mask the lesbian theme within the film, but also creates an avenue that allows for the audience to empathize with the lesbian couple. Bungee Jumping of Their Own shows a man who lost his girlfriend in a tragic accident. Later in the film, the main character begins noticing his lost girlfriend's soul reincarnated in one of his male students. The homosexuality is only pursued because of the pre-existing heterosexual love that the main character treasures and longs for. This film raised a lot of voices both in favor and against the message of the film. Putting this sexuality politic aside, this film is the embodiment of the camouflage age in its masking of the queerness under elements that justifies and slash or tolerates the themes. The conversation of the camouflage age becomes more complex with the voices of Korean gay activists in Korea under organizations such as Chingyusai or Hand in Hip. During this era, some activists have called out against the masking and promoted the message that a gay man is no different than a straight man. These activists have stated that these masking perpetuates a message that deems heterosexuality as the normal while any deviance would be seen evil. These activists partnered with smaller film companies to produce films that portrayed LGBT relationships just like any other relationships that are portrayed in genres of romance comedy. Others voiced more in favor of the masking strategy under the camouflage age, stating that this act of masking allowed queerness to become depoliticized and therefore allowed in the public sphere. Just like this, the camouflage age was a time when films were at the center of these crucial conversations among the LGBT movement in South Korea. Some other films during this time period included Bangja 2000, Flower Island 2001, Desire 2002, Weni and Juna 2002, and Road Movie 2002. It is also worthwhile to note the coming out of a Korean celebrity, Hong Suk-chan, on September 9, 2000 under this camouflage era. Harasu also appeared on March 2001 with her famous commercial where she openly shared her experience as a trans woman. These two figures symbolized and sparked conversations of LGBT themes within the media industry. Blockbuster Age 2005 early 2010s. Considering the passage of a historic anti-discrimination bill that includes sexual orientation, the general atmosphere and the media was shifting. This age can also easily be described by the sheer amount of opposition against the LGBT community in the public space. The Blockbuster Age was the era where LGBT representation, as well as sexuality in general, was more explicitly adopted, and this remains salient to this day. One of the most notable shifts during this era was the use of LGBT themes in more mainstream Korean dramas. LGBT themes began surfacing within dramas such as The First Shop of Coffee Prince 2007 and Personal Taste 2008, but really surfaced fully in Life is Beautiful 2010. Besides these dramas, the most well-known LGBT film in the mainstream Korean media was The King and the Clown 2005. This movie sold more than 12 million tickets, which was marked as one of the great successes in the Korean film industry. This film sparked a new narrative of the flower boy that showcased the visually attractive notion of a gay man. Jungmin Kwon, a film professor in Portland State University, talks about the phenomenon of straight women fantasizing over gay bodies for these reasons and attributes The King and the Clown as one of the factors. Films such as Antique 2008 and A Frozen Flower 2008 also played on the similar element of pretty boys within a gay context. Examples of South Korean queer cinema. Below is a list of some of the films and television series that have had LGBT themes. Film, television, references, equals,